Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Munn, and I'm with the League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series called Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series close to 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. As you may have heard, the Washington State Legislature has invested billions of dollars into our education system, intending to fully fund schools. But inequities still across the state still persist. In today's webinar, the League of Education Voters Senior Policy Analyst, Vela, will show you the funding inequities through interactive maps of Washington's 295 school districts, and there'll be a time to answer some of your questions. Jake has asked me to not read his bio to you, so I'm going to direct you to educationvoters.org website, but I'm going to tell you he's a great cook, big outdoorsman, and he has a new dog. With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few housekeeping items. You'll notice the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. This is a space for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on that Q&A function or at info at educationvoters.org. So with that, welcome, Jake.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We have an action-packed webinar for you today. So I will be going over some education funding data and to provide a little context for that. And we will be getting the presentation up for you to see shortly. And to give a little context to some of the data that we'll be showing today, this data reflects what was passed last legislative session, in the 2017 session via HB 2242. It does not show any changes that were made that impact funding from this most recent session in 2018, which would be SB 6362. Although there were changes made, the overall funding changes that were made had a very little net impact, less than $150 million statewide. And as we wanted to use OSPI produced numbers that would be reliable and verifiable to people across the state, those numbers, as of the production of this presentation, had not yet been released. But those won't fundamentally change any of the broad strokes or themes that we'll be sharing with you today. So to kind of kick off today's presentation, we'll be going over some slides to kind of show some more context for Washington State as a whole, to kind of see some of the variations that we have in a huge state of 295 districts that serves over 1 million students. So what this map is showing you is showing you the low-income student enrollment percentages for districts across the state as defined by eligibility for the federal free and reduced price lunch program. And as you can see in the legend to the right, with the different colors associated with the different tiers, it has the percentages that each of those colors represent. And the number in parentheses is the number of districts that fall within that tier, followed by the number of students enrolled in those districts. So for the 80 to 100% FRL enrollment rate, there's 28 districts that fall within that range, accounting for roughly 30,000 students across the state. An important note, the level for free and reduced price lunch is federally determined, and that's 185% of the federal poverty level, which for a little context is roughly $45,000 for a family of 4. And that threshold is going to be the same no matter what district you're in the state of Washington. And as you can see, it's mostly lower, smaller districts in rural Washington that have the higher free and reduced price lunch enrollment rates. And it's also important to note that this shows district-wide averages and does not necessarily account for concentrations of high poverty found in some districts, especially some of the larger districts across the state. And this next map shows populations of students who are highly mobile. So what I've done here is added homeless student data with foster youth data, in addition to the migrant student enrollments for the state of Washington. These are 3 highly mobile populations that need additional supports. That currently there's no explicit state funding formulas that are directed towards these 3 populations. To show another way to kind of visualize or see the variety and types of student needs that we have across the state of Washington, and how they might not always comport or fit with our existing expectations. And this map shows the rough median income breakdown by school district. And this is a rough map. It does not show the district-specific median income yet, but it shows the county in which it's located, the median income of the county in which it's located. So that's why there's bigger groupings of districts across the state. But as you can see, there's quite variation from districts that have a median income as low as $41,000 to districts in the Puget Sound region that have median incomes of up to $85,000. So as you go from north to south or east to west, there's a lot of variation in the regional income of different parts of the state. And as you can keep this map in mind and what it kind of shows you, will kind of lead you into the next map, which is when we're start to talk about the changes that were made in the 2017 legislative session in regards to educator salary. So what this map shows is a new state-funded salary levels for each district. They range from $66,455 starting, and this would be in the 2019-2020 school year, as the minimum amount that every district will get in the least. And every district will generate at least that much per teacher. So the districts will be able to determine their own salary allocation model. So they'll get at least $66,455 per teacher, but they will design their own allocation model to allocate money as they see fit to beginning teachers, to more experienced teachers, or to teachers depending on other factors. And as you can see, there's a wide variation across the state from $66,000 to $85,000. But the highest paid districts are concentrated in the Puget Sound region, mainly because the largest factor determining additional salary enhancements for districts is based on the housing value, property values in those districts. So the higher property value areas are going to be generating a higher level of funding for teacher salary across the state. There was also an additional change made this most recent session called the experience factor, which for districts that have higher than median teacher experience, as well as higher than average master's degree attainment for the teacher workforce, qualify for what's called the experience factor, which is a 4% enhancement on the base salary of $66,455. And what they did is they took the current data of the teacher workforce demographics in each of the districts, and based on the criteria which districts qualified for that point in time data of the teacher workforce, and starting in 2019-2020 and through the 2022-2023 school year, they will qualify for this additional enhancement based on the characteristics of their teacher workforce. So as you can see, there's a large variation across the state, but most of the highest paid districts are clustered in the Puget Sound region because the majority of these funds are directed based on the housing values of the district, of the school district.
So Jake, I have a question. So there is no accounting for recruitment issues in this?
That is true. If you look at other states, there's a number of factors that sometimes go into how they allocate teacher salary at the state level. In this case, they factored in housing costs and as I mentioned before, the experience factor, but they do not account for harder staff areas, whether that be high poverty districts or whether that be rural and remote school districts in Eastern Washington especially, that have a hard time either attracting teachers or once they are attracted to keep them there. This does not account for those challenges that some districts face across the state.
Thank you.
So taking into account, since overall staff salaries account for over 80% of district costs, and since the biggest changes that were made last year were to increase not only teacher salary, but all staff salary, from principals to central office administration to bus drivers and maintenance workers. So since the largest salary increases went to the Puget Sound area districts, as you can see, the percent increases, the largest increases are also highly correlated to the last map I showed you. Other factors that can influence whether the percent increase that some districts will receive would be dependent on their characteristics of their teacher workforce prior to the changes that were made in the 2017 session. Prior to the 2017 session and through this current school year, the average education and experience of a district teacher workforce determined how much state funding they got from the state. So districts with already high teacher experience levels and high teacher education levels aren't going to see as much of an increase as districts who have tend to have a very inexperienced workforce or have a lower degree of master's attainment within their teacher workforce. So the teacher workforce characteristics, whether or not the districts got an enhancement for a higher cost of living, will be the major determinant on the percent increase in funding as a result of the changes in the 2017 session. And as you can see, there's a variety. Some districts saw pretty substantial increases of 40+%, while others saw somewhere in between a 3 and 9% increase. But as you can see, the districts that only saw a 3 to 9% increase account for 12 of the 295 districts, with a total enrolled student population of 768 students. And you can see those darker districts, and keep those in mind as we look to the next map, which will highly correlate to this map, which shows the per student funding rate after the changes were made in the 2020-21 school year, which will be the year in which all the last changes will be funded, including the additional state-funded teacher professional development that was included in HB 2242 in the 2017 legislative session. So this shows the amount of per student funding just from the state sources. So it does not include local funding or federal funding, just state funding. And as you can see, there's a pretty wide variation across the state. The highest funded districts are similar to the districts that saw a minimal increase in the last map, and that's because there already tend to be rural and remote schools who, through some funding formulas, already get salary enhancements because of the fact that they're small or remote, and the fact that with economies of scale, you need substantial inputs even just to serve a handful of students in smaller districts. But as you can see, if you look at the per student funding levels of the $11,000 per student to $13,000 per student, those kind of middle tiers, those two sets of districts combined account for about 85 to 90% of all the student population in the state of Washington. So between $11,000 and $30,000 in those districts, about 85 to 90% of the students are in those districts. So most districts fall within that $11,000, $13,000 range, but of course there are districts that kind of fall both below and above those levels. And the next map we have, there are also some significant changes made to the local levy system last session, in the 2017 session. And this map shows the effects of some of those changes. As many know, the local levy system was changed pretty significantly in 2017 to change the way in which the maximum allowed local levy revenue could be raised by local districts. So what this does, this shows the different tiers of maximum levy rates that could be passed by districts. With the new levy law, they restricted the maximum amount of per student funding a district can raise through the local levy to $2,500 per student, or a levy rate of $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed value, which is often referred to as $1.50 levy rate. So if a district raises $1.50 and still can't raise that $2,500 per student, then they're capped at whatever that $1.50 would generate. So some districts can only generate roughly $500 with a $1.50 levy, while some districts can raise $2,500 per student, the levy of about 80 cents. But districts that can raise less than $1,500 per student, with given the new local levy caps, become eligible for LEA if they pass a levy, and if they max out their local levy, they're awarded their maximum local effort assistance possible from the state. And if you combine the LEA local effort assistance amounts with the local levy amounts, those two can equal no more than $1,500. So you have roughly 188 districts, which account for about 75% of the overall student enrollment of the state of Washington, are capped at that $1,500 threshold when you add together both local levy dollars and local effort assistance from the state. While you have roughly 43 districts accounting for 126,000 students, that will be able to raise that $2,500 per student because they have those higher property values that allow them to generate a higher amount of money per student with a lower levy rate for the district.
So Jake, can you reiterate what you can buy with your levy? It looks like 2/3 of the state gets about $1,000 per student less. So what is it that they won't be able to buy?
That's a very good question. So levies are intended to be an enrichment onto basic education and enhance what the state provides for a basic education. So they can do anything from providing leadership opportunities for school staff, to be mentors, to take on extracurricular activities, to coach sports, to mentor other teachers. It could be used for a number of things. It could be used to lower a class size ratio. It could be used to add additional counselors, social workers, or family engagement coordinators. So it could be used on a number of different areas across the school or the district. And as you can see, if we zoom in really quickly, you'll get some areas, for example, in, go with the Puget Sound for the time being. If districts that, like a Lake Washington, Bellevue, Seattle, this area of the state can raise that full $2,500, while some of their neighbors, like Highline, Kent, will be capped at that $1,500 threshold. So there will be that $1,000 difference between what one district can raise and another district can raise through the local levy system, including LEA. And this is, I think, one of the issues that has been brought up by many folks of some challenges that the new system brings to them. Not only reducing the amount of money they can raise locally, because many districts raised $3,000, $4,000, even more dollars per student in the previous system that will be ending at the end of this current calendar year, which will be significantly less than what the new cap will allow for. And all districts across the state will be able to raise less money now going forward than they have historically. And this last map, when you combine the local levy changes that I just discussed, along with the salary enhancements that were discussed earlier, when you add those two combined and look at the overall percent increase in available resources for districts, when you essentially look at how their budget will change, adding in state and local resources together because of the recently passed changes, this is what the map looks like. So you have, my apologies. There was an issue with the slide, and this is actually showing the same slide from before, not the combined state and local funding. I'm sorry, there was some technical difficulties with this, with the program I was using. So I will get the actual map to you at a later point in time. My apologies for that. But that concludes the last set slide I have. And I now believe we can open it to questions.
So just as a reminder, you can type in your questions with the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. No question is too basic. I want to reiterate that. I am sure there are others. There's quite a few people on this today to ask the questions. In the meantime, before we have any, I am going to ask one myself, and that is these funding decisions, were not based on any data around how difficult it is to recruit teachers. You've answered that. What about based on student need, right? Where there are concentrations of students who are free and reduced lunch eligible?
Of the enhancements that were made in 2017, of the several billion dollars that was added, roughly 85% of the overall investments went to was generally applied evenly across the state. Only around 15% of that were dedicated to students who need additional supports. That includes additional money for low-income students, for special education students, as well as students eligible for the transitional bilingual instructional program. What was added in 2017 was an enhancement for schools who have high concentrations of free and reduced price lunch eligible students. So if there are over 50% of the enrolled students at a school are eligible for the free and reduced price lunch program, they will get an additional enhancement from the state that must go directly to that school, must be spent at that school. The rest of LAP funds, of the Learning Assistance Program funds that are directed towards, that are generated by low-income students, are sent to the district, and then the district then decides how to allocate those funds. This is a one pot of funds that is directed specifically to the school level, based on high levels of poverty within that school.
And that's part of the 15% of the $1 billion.
That's part of the 15%, yes. Okay.
So this first question is, can you summarize what the final map would have shown?
The final map essentially would show no really consistent picture. With all the changes, your current levy that was collected prior to the changes, the teacher workforce characteristics of your district, whether they're experienced, how experienced they are, and their education levels would impact how much funding you get, as well as whether or not you got regionalization factor, so the bump up for high cost of living in this new way of funding teacher salaries. All three of those factors have a significant impact on the amount of funding a district will get, additional funding a district would get based on the changes. And you would still see that most of the biggest increases would be in the Puget Sound area. That still holds true. But the rest of the state would be a real mixed bag as far as what it really tells you on patterns of what regions or what areas saw bigger increases.
Thank you. What is the percent range in changes or percent change in the total local and state funding?
In the combined increases in state and local funding combined, the high, I believe, was around, you had 1 or 2 districts at that 40 to 42% range, but most of them fell in that 20 to 20% increase when you factor in both local and state funding. That's mainly because even if districts got a significant amount of more money in state funding, since their local levy, how much they could raise through their local levy was decreased in some cases by $1,000 to $2,000 per student. That decreased their percentage by a pretty substantial margin. But overall, it's still a net increase in overall funds available for the district.
And what is the dollar amount, and if possible, the percent of new dollars?
The dollar amount per school year is roughly
or a dollar amount increase. That's new money.
That's new money. It was roughly, as it was framed after it was initially passed, it's roughly $8.2 billion over the course of 4 years. So that translates into roughly a $2 billion a year increase in additional funding for K-12 education, with the majority of that being accounted for by the increases in teacher, principal, administrator, and classified staff salary, which would be bus drivers, administrative staff, and custodians and such.
What can't local levy dollars be used for?
Local levies cannot be used for the provision of basic education. The issue with that is that there are some things that that the legislature has said that the money can be used on, and it cannot be used on basic education. But what exactly is defined as basic education is a little bit, and there's some ambiguity there. Most people, most observers have been under the impression or belief that, say, like core elements of basic education, like say base teacher salary, you cannot use local levy dollars to pay for base teacher salary, but you could use local levy dollars to hire more educators to have a lower class size ratio, or hire more counselors to have a lower counselor to student ratio, or pay teachers additionally to take on additional roles and responsibility, both within the school day and outside of the school day.
Well, are districts receiving more funding now than they would have if HB 2242 had not passed?
Districts will be receiving more money than they were previously when you look at state and local resources combined. It's with the changes to the levy system, it's not as much new money as otherwise would have been the case, since one pot increased while the other pot decreased. The increase in the state funding more than outweighed the decrease in local funding. But the degree to which that is true does vary across the state. But all districts will be getting additional money. And the districts that would have been potentially harmed by this from a financial perspective, there were provisions in the law, at least for the next several years, to hold them harmless, so they're not going to be negatively impacted from a financial perspective as a result of the laws. And mainly those are districts that are in smaller districts in Eastern Washington, more so than the Puget Sound area.
Will the experience factor baseline data ever be revisited in order to adjust for changes in those districts' median tenure and education level?
That's a very good question. In SB 6362, which is the legislation that passed that additional salary enhancement that will go into effect in the 2019-2020 school year, they give no indication that they will be revisiting that. And the legislature produces a document that projects out the salary enhancements that each district qualifies for the next several years. And the districts that qualify for it in the first year in 2019-2020 qualify for it for the extent to which they project out those numbers. So there's no indication that they will go back and revise it, But of course, that's the legislature's prerogative, and they could always go back and readjust those numbers.
What will the legislature do to fix the inequities?
That is a very heavy question that I imagine they're debating right now. I think one of the issues with what was done, or a lot of the conversations around McCleary the last couple of years, is that there were people on both all supportive of McCleary that were trying to use it as either one, a way to just adequately fund the system, or two, adequately fund the system in a more equitable fashion. But when it came down to it, the court was not saying that the state had to more equitably fund the state of Washington. We had to adequately fund schools across the state of Washington. So that was a hope for change in the way that we fund schools, but it was never a requirement that the legislature had to do as part of meeting the McCleary requirement. But now that we have, well, we will see in the coming weeks what the court thinks of the state's plan to fully fund education. But if they determine it to be sufficient, then the next questions will be, what do we do to improve the system to make sure it does meet the needs of students, to make sure the students who do need more supports do have those additional supports available to them.
And what's LEV's plan around inequities in funding?
I think one is to better understand how schools are actually funded. We know how they're funded from the state level, but the way in which that data is reported from the schools and districts up to the state is very unclear at best. And then starting in 2019, 2020, we will have a better sense of how districts actually allocate the money and how they prioritize certain schools with the funding that they do get from the state. So part of it is understanding what the current landscape actually is, but also being more thoughtful on how we do invest the limited resources we have to make sure that students of a variety of different needs, from low-income students to ELL students to special education students to refugee students, do have the proper supports they need to be successful in school. And I think everyone's is interested in what that may look like in our ideal education system as we move forward in the coming years.
Would you say that there is more or less inequity now in funding schools across the state? You're in the hot spot, Jake.
I'm in the hot spot. I don't know if I want to answer. It's difficult. Equity wasn't substantially improved by the major changes made to the state funding formula. It was an opportunity to create more equity, and that opportunity wasn't necessarily taken full force. But at the same time, the changes made to the local levy system, I think it's pretty clear to say that because of the changes made, because of what effectively the two-tier levy system that's been put in place does create more inequity than the levy system was inequitable before, but this arguably made it even more inequitable. So I think that's a real concern, not only for us, but districts across the state, both in the Puget Sound and Eastern Washington, in Vancouver, and in the Tri-Cities have all shown their displeasure for the approach to the levy system. So I think that's a source of inequity that did get worse, that we really need to be thoughtful about how we could both make sure that districts can raise money locally, but also make sure that those districts with lower property values have a harder time raising local levies aren't left at a disadvantage because of the lower property values of their districts.
Thank you, Jake. This wraps up our LEVinar today, and I'm going to pose a question to you that I would like you to send a little note to us on our Q&A chat function on the bottom of your screen. And that is, we are considering doing another further deeper dive into some of the complexities around the funding across the state. And we are interested in knowing if you would like to attend And if so, what questions you would like us to answer. So please feel free to send us a message through the chat function or email to info@educationvoters.org. We are considering, and we will run the LEVinar if you tell us to do so. We are thinking about doing it Thursday, May 29th, the same time, 12:30 to 1. Let us know, because we'd like to know.
Yeah, if we could do it just through email, that would be better when I end this.
Oh, okay. So I'm rescinding the chat function, and please send it via email to info@educationvoters.org. As always, we want to thank you for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or comments, you can also send them to me, Kelly, at educationvoters.org. There is a recording of today's presentation that'll be available on our website. Please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And again, thank you for attending, and we hope you join us again. And please let us know if you'd like us to do more in-depth mapping around the funding and equity, and send it to info@educationvoters.org. Thank you.